Early in the 20th century, there were few untouched geographical destinations, except for the South Pole. How to get there required great creativity. Creative thinking applied to planning and tactics. Two rival explorers raced to be the first, Robert Falcon Scott of England and Roald Amundsen of Norway. On January 17, 1912, Robert Scott reached the South Pole to find the Norwegian flag there waiting for him. Amundsen had been there 1 month earlier, on December 14, 1911. Certainly sad, but coming in second is not a tragedy. The tragedy is that Scott and his party perished on the return trek. Initially celebrated for his heroic efforts, but later analysis by experts showed that the creative planning skills of the two explorers accounted for Amundsen's success and Scott's tragic failure. Let's examine the different tactics used by these two explorers. Let's look at transportation. Amundsen had a simple plan. He combined skiing for the men and dog sleds to haul the gear. Scott had a complicated plan, combining motorized sledges, ponies, dogs, skiing, and men hauling their own gear. While Scott agreed with the advice from experts to rely mainly on skiing, he provided no training to his team. This inexperience meant that the team did not make good use of the skis. Amundsen's team was composed largely of expert skiers, and in fact, a champion skier was their front-runner. Scott planned to have a majority of hauling work done by the ponies. Ponies are not well suited for the conditions of the South Pole. They have small hooves compared to their weight, which meant they sank into the snow. Dogs are better suited to the cold weather. They have great mobility in the snow, and they need little care. The Norwegian team fed their dogs seal and penguin meat, which are readily available in Antarctica. Scott's team fed their dogs dried fish, which did not agree with the dogs, leading to their deterioration. In fact, all the dogs eventually died and were eaten by Scott's team. Let's look at diet even a little more. Scott took an insufficient amount of rations, especially to feed men who were hauling equipment. And the rations they had were deficient in vitamin B and C, and as a result, many in Scott's party developed scurvy. The cooking fuel tins were known to have faulty seals, and as a consequence, the men in Scott's group had to eat frozen meals and were deprived of water. Amundsen had the fuel tins soldered. They were soldered closed to prevent the leaking fuel problem. 50 years later, tins from this expedition were found, and they were still full. In terms of their travel tactics, they varied greatly. Amundsen, learning from the Inuit, recruited experienced dog drivers. To make the most of the dogs, they paced them, deliberately keeping the daily mileages shorter than necessary for 75% of the journey. The Norwegian team spent 16 hours per day resting and traveled with their backs to the sun to prevent snow blindness. In contrast, half of Scott's team suffered from snow blindness. Their approach to route marking and depot laying was vastly different as well. For the last 180 miles of the trip, Amundsen had the route marked like a Norwegian ski route, using marker flags every 8 miles. To this, he added a marker every mile by leaving an empty food container that he had painted black before the trip. From 82 miles in, the Norwegians built 6-foot cairns every 3 miles, containing a note recording the cairn's position, the distance to the closest depot, and the direction to the next cairn. Each depot had a line of bamboo flags laid transversely every half mile for 5 miles on either side of the depot. Scott relied on very few depots, and those he established were marked with walls built during lunch to protect the ponies and had a single flag. In his diary, Scott recorded great concern in finding his route and had many close calls. Amundsen used simple navigational sheets that minimized calculations for his team, especially when they were tired and cold. 4 of his team were navigators, and they brought along a sextant, which is light and relatively simple for navigation. Scott used heavier navigation equipment that required more mental arithmetic. One final tactical error for Scott was his decision to take a 5th man on the final leg of the journey to the pole, although he had rations for only 4. Why did I share this story with you? I wanted to highlight the importance of tactical thinking when you are going to go into a new area. The arrogance and poor decision-making on the part of Scott caused him his life and the life of his party. Scott and his pole party died 11 miles short of a 1-ton depot. The depot was originally planned to be placed 31 miles closer to the South Pole, but was not, due to the weakness of the ponies. Creativity is about pursuing something new. You're like an explorer. To ensure success, it's critical to make a solid plan. If you're going someplace new, you have to be ready. A plan isn't so important if you're going someplace you've already been. When venturing into a new territory, it's helpful to go in with a clear plan in place. Following the natural flow of creative problem solving, we move from the develop step to the implement step. So why include implement in a creative process? Is it enough just to have the solution? Where's the creativity in implementation? There are 3 reasons why we include implement in a creative process like creative problem solving. First, the develop step helps to yield novel solutions or a new change. We're leaving our comfort zone, so it's useful to have an action step that guides us as we go into this new direction. Remember, you're like an explorer. Secondly, sometimes we need to get creative and imaginative in creating an action plan, like how Amundsen painted food cans black and used them as markers after the fuel was spent. And the third reason, selling or pursuing something novel may require imagination to gain buy-in. When we create, we're intentionally introducing a change. And change is not always warmly embraced by others. So we may need to get creative in selling our idea, which requires imagination. So in the implement step, we're going to do a number of things. We're going to explore acceptance. Up to this point, we've not really thought about the environment in which we're introducing the proposed solution or the proposed change. We have to scan this environment and think about what we need to consider in order to have this solution or change accepted. We make a plan. And in this lecture, we'll be looking at a number of tools that help us to create a plan. And then we go into action. And we monitor ourselves as we're rolling out our plan, making adjustments and applying creative thinking as necessary. At this point in the process, we're using tactical thinking, which is the ability to devise and carry out a plan that includes specific measurable steps for attaining the desired state. Now, the first tool we're going to use is called simply Action Plan. This has 5 steps. The first step is to describe a solution, a change, or a destination you wish to meet. You write out the solution or the proposed change so it's clear in your mind. We use a statement starter. I or we are committed to. In the case of our South Pole explorers, they might have said, we are committed to being the first to get to the South Pole and then returning safely. The returning safely part is important because this needs to be taken into consideration as we create our action plan so that we are preparing to overcome any risk by making sure that we've anticipated those risky aspects of the trip. In the next step, we diverge on action steps. We use divergent thinking tools that we've learned before, like brainstorming or brainwriting, tools that help us to generate many action steps that will guide our tactics, the concrete things that need to be done to successfully realize the solution or the change. And note, it's very important to diverge here. Remember, you're an explorer, you're going into a new direction. So it's important that you examine all of the action steps. In the third step, we converge on the most important action steps. We use HITS to identify those action steps that are going to be most important and valuable to us to achieve our desired end. Perhaps in some ways, Scott failed here. He'd been presented with some diverse opinions about skiing and using dogs, but he ignored these to some degree. He stayed with things that he was comfortable with. As a result, in not exploring these more novel action steps, by staying with what was comfortable to him, he threatened his team and the survival of his team. In our next step, we determine the time horizon, we create a timetable, we organize our action steps, and then we apply them and we follow those action steps. We begin by identifying an end date, when we need to have the solution or change fully implemented. And then we create 4 blocks of time: immediate, short-term, intermediate, and long-term. And we suggest that the immediate begin within 24 to 48 hours in order to create momentum. Here again, perhaps Scott failed. He, in fact, deviated from his action plan. One of his critical errors during the last leg of the trip was taking along a 5th member of the team when he only had rations to support 4. And then finally, we organize our action steps into a timetable, and we follow that timetable. We take our selected action steps and we place them in a sequence in the timetable that you've created, organizing the action steps in a sequence over time, moving from immediate to short-term to intermediate and long-term. And it's important to look this over to make sure that there aren't gaps, things that are overlooked. Scott brought along skis, but he failed to train the members of his team in being able to ski and therefore wasn't able to use that. That was a gap. That was a step that was crucial and overlooked. Now, you can expand the action step if you want to add more detail to it. You can have action steps along a timeline. You can have action steps along a timeline, and that may be sufficient, but there are times you want more detail. Detail can be added to make this tool even more systematic. Detail is important, especially when you have a group action plan. Beyond the action steps, you can add accountability factors. And again, this is especially helpful when you have a group. You can have a specific deadline instead of these large blocks of times. You can have someone who's identified as being responsible for that particular action step. And you can identify to whom the completion of that action step will be reported. Rich Products, a company in Buffalo, New York, a multinational food producer, ends every meeting with an action register. In this action register, they conclude the meeting by saying, what actions must we do now that we've brought this meeting to an end, and who's responsible? Project management literature provides many tools that are useful for following up and tracking actions. Let's look at another tool for implementation. This tool is called the how-how diagram. The previous approach to creating an action plan was more intuitive. It relied on our ability to think in divergent ways of action steps. The how-how diagram is more structured. The how-how diagram drills down into specific action steps to move our solution forward. It's sort of like the webbing tool that we used in Clarify, where we asked basic questions to shift our perspective, why and what's stopping you. With the how-how, we ask, how do we achieve this solution? How do we achieve this end goal? How do we get to this end state? We repeatedly ask this, and every time we ask it, it forces us to be more concrete. So we begin by identifying a solution or a proposed change. Again, we write a summary stating I or we are committed to fulfilling X, Y, or Z. And then we ask how, and we record our responses. Considering this proposed solution, how will we accomplish this? We record our responses, and we can add on the word else to move us laterally. We ask how again and record those responses to the initial set of actions that have been written. And we consider each option that's been created and ask how every time, continuing to drill down. We continue to ask and record until we reach the natural end of this thread of thinking. Let's look at an example. Let's imagine that our solution is to improve efficiency and collaboration among employees by rearranging and restructuring the office complex. This is what we're committed to. This is our intended change. So we ask how. How might we accomplish this? So we want to improve efficiency and collaboration among employees by rearranging and restructuring the office space. How will we get this done? How can we accomplish this? Well, one response would be, we need to create a master plan. Well, how else might we accomplish this? We need to create a project budget. And then we can ask how one more time, and the response might be, we might need to identify departmental physical space needs with respect to workflow. We can then take this action step, this initial series of responses, and ask how to each one of those. In terms of creating the master plan, we ask how. Well, one response is to consult with a space designer. Well, how else? Well, we could solicit ideas from the section heads. How else? We can examine physical layout of other companies. And there might be one more action step related to creating a master plan. Conduct a study of the present space utilization. One of the initial action steps with the first question, how, was to create a project budget. Again, we can drill deeper into this action by asking how. How will we go about creating a project budget? Well, we can identify available financial sources locally. How else? Well, we can speak with senior management at headquarters about the project and identify additional sources of funding. Let's go back to the original set of responses and try this one more time. Drilling down into the response, identify departmental physical space needs with respect to workflow. Again, we might ask how to go further into this particular action. One response might be to conduct focus group sessions with employees. Well, how else might we identify departmental physical space needs? Another response might be to capture workflow via a process map. I encourage you to try this tool. You need a sheet of paper and you need to follow along using the word how, sort of branching out like a tree. Or you can do it in your mind. I'm going to walk you through this, identifying something that's important for you to accomplish. Think about perhaps a goal that you identified earlier, or think about something that you might wish to accomplish within the year or within the next calendar year. Think of a few goals that you have, and then select one, and then write it down or make sure it's firmly planted in your mind. Now, how will you accomplish this? Record or think about this. What are 2 or 3 things that you need to do to accomplish this? For me, let's say my goal is to get healthier, to improve my health. Well, 3 thoughts that might occur to me are change in diet, exercise, find ways to relax more. Now, we take these new action steps and we ask how again. In your mind, ask how to the initial action steps that you generated. How will you achieve those actions? In terms of a healthier diet, changing my diet, one response might be to take healthy cooking classes. Well, how might I do that? Visit websites of local cooking classes to examine the programs that they're offering. You see, as we continue to ask how, these become extremely concrete. You can repeat this and continue to work through this how-how diagram, and you can perhaps do this later after this lecture. Take the time. This systematic deliberate tool has a significant advantage in that it really clearly lays out the things that we need to do. By drilling down in this way, you might ensure that no action step is overlooked. This is particularly good for low implementers or people who are high ideators that tend to think in more global and abstract ways. And one of the nice things about this tool is that it's visual, and it shows relationships among the action steps. Speaking of visual, there's a creative and visual way that we can monitor an action plan as we're implementing it. It's called the performance dashboard. So picture your car dashboard. If you're driving your car right now, it'll be easy for you to do that, but please don't stare at it. What are the benefits of these visual metrics? What do they do for you? Compare your current car dashboard perhaps to a past dashboard. What's useful? What do you have now that you didn't have then? For example, I like the real-time readout of miles per gallon. That helps me to monitor my driving behavior. The purpose of the performance dashboard is to provide a visual monitor for our progress by giving us dynamic feedback mechanisms. It's based on a simple metaphor, the car dashboard. Here's an example of a performance dashboard. Maybe you've seen these yourself. At Buffalo State, every year there's a major fundraiser. And when you pull onto the campus, there's a thermometer that you pass by. And the red line on the thermometer indicates how close our organization is to the goal. And every time I pass this, if I haven't contributed yet, it makes me feel guilty. In this way, it compels me to action. And it lets our community know how well we're doing in terms of moving towards our goal. Performance dashboard can be employed individually. Remember, Hemingway, at the end of every day, charted the number of words that he had written each day. It can also be designed for team application. You can come up with a common set of measures and a common language that the team agrees to, and you can monitor the success of a team as they roll out some action steps. As a team, here are 4 steps you can go through when using the performance dashboard. First, you generate a set of indicators that can be effective for monitoring the progress of your plan. And this can include soft measures such as motivation, commitment, ownership, resistance to change. You pick the measures that are most useful for the stakeholders in the scenario, and then you design those. You select and combine the most important indicators and check that all the critical objectives are being tracked. You transform these indicators into a visual dashboard. You create a visual dashboard and you make it public. And then finally, you meet regularly with the team to review the metrics, updating the dashboard. Use the dashboard to spark conversation with the team and to act proactively, to make adjustments perhaps. Here's an example. A team recently went through a process where they identified cohesion as an issue. The elements of trust and conflict, commitment and accountability were identified as being issues that need to be worked on. After they examined this situation, they decided to create a dashboard, and they defined a couple of metrics that helped them to move towards greater cohesion. One metric might have been what they called a trustometer, like a speedometer, to measure individual willingness to be open with each other. The indicator on this trustometer might have been low, medium, or high. They might have also decided to use an artificial harmony sensor, an alarm that goes off when they're not dealing effectively with conflict. So what are some of the benefits of the performance dashboard? Well, first of all, it's a deliberate approach for monitoring the action steps as you're executing and rolling out, pursuing the solution. As a team, it helps to build consensus upon what metrics are most important. It provides dynamic feedback and real-time feedback. It's visible or posted publicly. It helps to keep people focused on moving forward. It improves communication and coordination. Bring the metrics into meetings for discussion and update progress regularly. Let's try the performance dashboard. Find an area in your life in which you wish to improve performance. It could be personal, could be professional, could be a hobby, could be a sport that you're pursuing. For me, I'll use golf as an example. Identify the specific things that you need to improve. If I use myself as an example, in golf, I might say, I want to be better at putting, or I want to get more balls in the fairway, etc. After you've identified those areas you wish to improve, create visual metrics to track your performance. Then, if you can, make it visible, display it. And if you can't display it, make it accessible so that you can check this and update it regularly. Use it for some period of time and track your performance, track your improvement. In this lecture, we looked at putting creative solutions into action. As Joel Barker said, vision without action is nothing more than an idle daydream. In the next lecture, we examine creative ways to sell our novel solutions.